I want to build an extending dining table. Our current dining table only seats 4. I came across this really cool design called a Dutch extending table, where the extending leaves can be stored underneath the main tabletop. But that's when I realised that it's not as simple as it looked. I spent many hours drawing on my computer trying to get to the bottom of how it actually works, and I think I've cracked it. For a few years now, I've been keeping hold of every piece of oak that was left over from various commissions and also some bits of salvaged oak. I don't know if I'll have enough to make the entire table, but I'll start by making the top. So starting with the milling process, which didn't go according to plan because a lot of this wood that I thought was oak wasn't oak. More on that shortly. But the idea was to get a straight edge and face on each piece of oak so that I could A, ascertain that I had enough oak to work with, and B, see the grain clearly and decide which pieces to use where. Some of the oak needed resawing, and I've always found it much quicker to establish my cut lines at the table saw first before running it through the bandsaw to remove the bit in the middle that the table saw blade couldn't reach. Then I can clean up the face at the planer. Right, I've got a bit of a problem. So far I've got enough oak for the main centerpiece of the tabletop and for about half of one of the extending leaves. All of this stuff over here seems to be a completely different species of wood. Once this stuff is planed, it looks like this. Now looking at this, I would have guessed that this is ash. But anyway, the crux of the matter is that this stuff here is now useless to me for this project. So I'm going to do something I don't do very often. I'm actually going to go and buy some timber. So this is the offcuts room at one of my local timber merchants, and as you can see they stock lots of different varieties of oak and some other hardwoods too. It was interesting to compare the English oak, European oak and American white oak. The American white oak was the best match to the boards that I had already milled up back at the workshop, and luckily for me it was also cheaper than the other varieties, although why that is I'm not sure. I chose 5 boards, which should be more than enough for what I needed, and it came to £96, which is around $123. So back to the workshop to get each board through the thicknesser, and I want all 3 of my tabletops to be 20mm thick. I did the glue up in small sections. I'm not using any biscuits, dominoes or dowels as the boards are all nice and straight, so I can just make sure they are properly aligned while clamping. I filled any knots with some filler, sanded up to 180 grit, and trimmed the ends. At this point I have the main top and my 2 extending leaves where the grain runs perpendicular to it. After trimming one end of the extending leaves, I can then mark up where to make the second cut so that they match the width of the main top. It would have been nice to have all the grain running in one direction, but the boards that I had were not long enough for that, and anyway, I think this looks good. Now to make the frame, and I wasn't sure I'd have enough oak to make it, but then I realised these old oak handrails, which I bought years ago, should give me enough material to make the legs of my table. I just need to do some strategic cutting. The legs are going to be angled and tapered. The angle I chose was 7 degrees, which I took right from the drawing that I'd worked on before, so I cut that angle at both ends. For the rails that join the legs, because the wood I'm using is salvaged, I need to check for any traces of metal before running them through my machines. And on the longer rails I need to cut that 7-degree angle where it meets the legs. Here's how the leg assembly is going to go together, but before I do that I want to taper my legs too to make them look more slender. And I do that at the bandsaw. This is a fresh blade, so I got a really clean cut. Checking that the legs all match up. And I decided to add a small round over. Then I can mark up for the joinery. I'll be using dominoes,
and I can get two 40 by 8mm dominoes in each leg. I cut a couple of wedges from scrap to allow me to clamp these up. And I use a clamp at the bottom of the assembly too, just loosely to bring them into where they need to be to close up the joints. And once the glue was dry, it was time for the second part of the assembly to get the short rails added. Then I can get the finish added to all of the components. I'm using hard wax oil, and the reason I did this now rather than later was because I was about to go away for a long weekend, and the first coat of hard wax oil can take up to 3 days to dry, and I hate not having access to my workshop while I'm waiting. When I got back from my trip, these are looking nice, but they'll need a second coat, but before I apply that, I denibbed with some 400 grit to get things back to being nice and smooth. And the second coat always tends to dry much quicker than the first. I think it took about a day, and then it was looking really nice.
So far, everything I've done has been inside of my comfort zone, and everything's gone really smoothly so far. Usually I'd have made at least 1 or 2 mistakes by now, but the next job definitely isn't in my comfort zone, which is all about how the extending mechanism is going to work. And the first component of that is going to be a couple of slats cut to the width of my table frame.
I've always struggled with components that move and mechanical things, so this next stage of the build was pretty daunting to me, but I just had to have faith in my drawing, because if the mechanism worked there, which it did, then so should this.
Now I can place my 2 extension leaves right up to those slats. And in theory, when I lower the main top over them, everything should align if I've got my measurements correct. And yeah, that feels pretty good. I've got the tops nicely centered to the frame now, and the next job is to measure up a piece that goes here, which will be secured to the main top.
To be on the safe side, I'm not going to use glue on the next few components, not yet anyway, as I may need to tweak some things. I clamped these in place so that I could flip the top over and add screws from underneath.
And now for the final component, the one that I'm the most worried about doing.
I didn't have enough oak left, so I'll use some beech here, and these rails are going to be what supports the extending leaves and what allows them to slide in underneath the main top. So I'm transferring the measurements from my drawing and keeping my fingers crossed. I'll explain how these rails work shortly in detail, but for now I can cut them at the bandsaw and then I can get them positioned. So to explain how I designed these rails, it's best to look at them in 2 halves, I think. In the first half, these hook parts slot underneath the rails, where they have a flat section so that they seat against the underside of those rails. The bottom edge of those rails is flat, but the top is tapered up to a point where they have another flat section that supports the ends of the main central tabletop. Now looking at the second half of the rails, the top of it continues flat right to the end to support the extending leaves, which overhang the end of the rails. The bottom of that rail is tapered too, but it has a small flat area at the end, which when the extending leaves are in the closed position, references against a notch that I'm about to cut in the short rails of the table. By the way, this is just my own interpretation of how I believe the mechanism should work. It may or may not be how a traditional Dutch extending table works. I'm not sure. These need to be cut at the perfect depth to support the extending leaf at the correct height so that it sits level with the central top. So I had to keep coming back to tweak these notches, removing a bit at a time and continually checking. And you can see by my face that I'm pleased after sighting it through. and a level confirms that it's nice and flat. At this point I cut a temporary spacer which matches the dimensions of the distance between the two notches. This will just help keep everything positioned. Then with the central top in place, I can offer up my extending leaf, and I'm going to add a couple of shims between them. This is just to make sure that nothing binds when everything is put together later. I can then get the rails secured, again not using any glue here because I still have some doubts about this working. Now my other two rails can be added on the other side, but they need to be offset from the first rails so that they don't knock into each other. And I followed the same process again. And by this point, after making a few minor tweaks and trying out the mechanism, I was confident that everything would work okay. So I came back and added glue before securing again with screws. Around the edges there were some very slight alignment issues between the main top and the extending leaves, just a millimetre or so, which I probably could have lived with to be honest, but I decided to sand and refinish all the edges just to true everything up nicely, as I needed to add finish to some of the bare components anyway.
So the vast majority of the time, we're going to have the table set up just like this. Nice, small and compact, and with plenty of space to walk around it. And then when we want to open it up, just lift up the main top, pull out the extension and drop it in. And I'm surprised actually at how sturdy this is. It can take plenty of weight, plenty of elbows, no problem whatsoever. I do have one minor regret, which is that I didn't make it a couple of inches wider. I had my family over at the weekend and we had 8 people around the table, and once you've got plates on here, you could do with a little bit more space in the middle. I do have plans and a full cut list available for this build. I think this top ended up being about 770mm wide, and in the plans I've tweaked that to 800. All that being said, I think this table is the best thing I've ever made. I've done well over 300 woodworking projects on this channel, and prior to this project my favourite was the super king sized bed that I built and the accompanying bedside tables. And while I don't think this table looks as interesting as the bed, I'm just so impressed with the mechanism and the way this works that it's my new favourite, and I am over the moon with it. If you want to check out the plans, there'll be links in the description box below, and thank you for watching.